So I'm Lisa, I think he said that, and we have some of my favorite people on stage with us today. First of all, thank you for coming to day 2 of the Escape 19 conference, the multi-cloud conference, and thank you for being early risers and actually coming for the morning keynote. And thank you, Jim, for putting together an amazing conference. I know how hard it is to do this, trust me. Can we all give Jim a nice round of applause? Really well done, really well done, and the whole team. It's not just one person, I know. Okay, so I'm here today. My name is Lisa. I run a user group in the San Francisco Bay Area, a rather large one, Cloudnative Containers. I'm told it's the largest CNCF user group, so there's that. I guess that's a good thing. Thank you. So I've been advocating for developers, for open source, for Kubernetes for sure, for a really long time, pretty much since the beginning, and before that for OpenStack and for Linux and for other awesome open source communities. Istio is my favorite little side hustle right now, if you want to join that community. It's a lot of fun. And I'm with folks that have been in not just Kubernetes, other projects as well, but for our purposes today, we're going to focus on Kubernetes because it's kind of, from what I heard yesterday, all roads leading to Kubernetes, and when it's coming to multi-cloud, making it a reality. So we have Sebastian, who's with Google. Hi, Sebastian. I'll let you introduce yourself in a second. Joseph, I want to say I love putting Joseph on panels because I always want to have an end user and somebody who's literally in the real world solving the hard problems. And so we asked Joseph all the really hard questions. And then Eric, before Eric was at Portworx, he was at Microsoft and then at Google, and he was on the early team, actually the first product manager for Kubernetes and a co-creator of GKE. So as you can see, we all have a lot of passion for Kubernetes, and we've been in it from the beginning. We care a lot about it, and we want to make sure it succeeds, as I'm sure you do as well. So my first question, so let me throw this one out to Eric. And as you guys speak for the first time, if you want to give yourself any more of an introduction, you can. But I think we should talk about what multi-cloud really means, because we talked about multi-cloud all day yesterday, and probably we could come up with 20 different definitions of it if I ask people in the room. So I pulled this from a Forbes article just to kind of make the point. So for our purposes today, Eric, do you want to just talk about what we're going to mean by multi-cloud today?
Yeah, I think, well, thank you everyone for being here. I think it's a great event, so I'm very happy to be here with this great group and Lisa. From a definitional point of view, I think public cloud and hybrid sometimes get mixed. And from, I think, our perspective, and everyone could jump in here, I think they're almost interchangeable. Right, there's different ways to achieve it. It could be whether you take, in our view, a platform-based approach, or it could be an application-based approach. But from just the idea of what is multi-cloud, what is hybrid, I think the idea here is really that I need to have an operational pattern that allows me to go into on-prem, into public clouds, into multiple public clouds. And just for simplification, I think multi-cloud hybrid can be used in a general sense as the same thing. I don't know if anyone here feels differently, and that's what we mean by multi-cloud here.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think for myself, especially because having this journey over the years, and trying to do multi-cloud even before things like Kubernetes evolved, it all kind of seemed to emerge together. And we started where we had things moving to the cloud, and then all of a sudden we'd go back to our data center and trying to run infrastructure as a service. So hybrid, multi, somehow or another, I think it's just kind of all collapsing together.
And not to hijack Lisa, I think one phrase you had yesterday that I love was accidental multi-cloud.
Yeah.
Maybe you could define that just as an evolution of multi-cloud.
Well, what I'm saying, and this has happened to me at where I'm currently at, before I was with a smaller mid-sized company that got acquired by Adobe. And so obviously Adobe is quite a large-sized company. And they're buying different companies that may be on AWS, which a lot of us are, or some are on like Google Compute Engine. So all of a sudden now you got to figure out like, all right, well, I have these different entities running on these platforms. And then, here's our company that got acquired, and we're running OpenStack in the data center, and we have AWS. So it just kind of happens, and then all of a sudden now you're really thrust as leaders to figure out like, how do we start converging? How do these things work together if they do? And there may be varying reasons of why you may stay in that state.
So, Joseph, and maybe you can just tell the group a little bit about what you do at Adobe and really why Adobe decided to go with multi-cloud.
Well, I think there's probably like the broader Adobe question, but the first one is just that, for myself, like I work directly with SREs. So, we're building infrastructure platforms. The platform that we work on specifically is the advertising cloud. It's a stock, kind of like a stock exchange in a sense. Advertisers are in there, bidding. So we just get billions of packets per second. So we have to be very pragmatic about a lot of the decisions that we make and like how we build and architect our platforms. And don't get me wrong, there's some parts that we are running bare metal because we run so much packets per second that we need that on the edge. And so we have to manage that though in a cloudy way. We have to figure out ways, how do we orchestrate that in amongst the other things that actually work really well in public cloud where we can actually extend our reach. So we leverage that as well. And at Adobe, I think, like as I mentioned earlier, they're like a lot of larger companies that are making these acquisitions. And there may be reasons. It could be that there's a preferred cloud provider because of like customers, or there could be other decisions that will drive them to say, hey, we don't want to use this cloud A, we need to be on cloud B or C, or we need a mixture of both, and some reach in areas that are more desirable for us. So Adobe, it's very similar. That's what you're seeing a lot of. I know we had some other gents that are going to be talking as well here at this conference, and they could probably give the more macro view of it. But I'm right in the weeds. I'm with the SREs. I'm dealing with the things that, how you make it run is kind of the world that I live in.
Okay. And Sebastian. So Sebastian's a DevOps expert. And so if you have time for questions at the end, you can ask him all your really hard DevOps questions. But since you are at Google, a couple of things that came up a little bit in the talks yesterday and also in the hallway conversations are standards. And should we really be looking at standardizing these clouds so that it makes it maybe easier for multi-cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I get back from the field and talking to customers of all sizes, small enterprises or giant multinationals or something like that, is like we already made this massive, substantial investment in cloud computing of some sort, and we don't want to have to continuously make these from scratch investments where as soon as another player comes into the marketplace, we have to like redo everything and then start from scratch and then go from there. What's interesting about the way that I think about multi-cloud from a DevOps perspective is, and if I've ever worked with any of you or if you've seen me speak in the past, I always say infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure is pointless. In the sense of like, I spun up a VM. Well, congratulations, you have an overhead cost. You're not delivering value back to your organization. And as a result, we really want to focus on the applications themselves. So it's interesting you mentioned talking about like from an SRE perspective or something like that. Like all I care about is the ability to run this application because that's tied to my business goal. Mm-hmm. And the easiest possible way to get there is through the adoption of open standards. If everybody has one standard for defining how an application performs, especially from a DevOps or an SRE perspective, like I need this many copies of it which is keyed off of this particular service level indicator, so on and so forth, then it just runs. And if something can understand how to read that and then get it to work, all the better. Essentially what I've just described is kind of like Kubernetes. There's a reason why that got super duper successful over the course of its life, as opposed to some of the other orchestrators or the other like schedulers that have been in the market. They weren't super application focused. And as a result, people that have adopted Kubernetes and then people that can run Kubernetes on multiple platforms are starting to realize that, wow, thanks to the open standards that we have here and thanks to its pluggable nature, Portworx being a fun example of that, but thanks to all of these things, I can write it and then just run it wherever I would like to run it, be it on the edge, on bare metal, in different clouds, in a hybrid way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty cool.
I think what you're saying though, it's you're still kind of at that control plane level, and I think where you may be alluding to, where I think where we need to get to though, is what I noticed Microsoft is like yesterday they just made some more announcements. They try to do it with like application bundles, specs, things like that, where we're just not at that layer yet where I'd love to see, because yeah, I don't want to worry about like the workloads, and we got containers, and that's great, but also containers have introduced a whole new set of challenges that we're having to work with, but we're working through them, and at least it gives us that atomic unit that we can ship something and we can kind of run there. But I think those are just partially some of the building blocks that are going to get us there. I think if we could get to these application standards that are on top of Kubernetes where we know we can kind of build towards that, I think it's going to enable these larger efforts, such things like control, like I think Crossplane is trying to tackle, or other companies are trying to tackle that. Hey, how do I orchestrate across these clouds? Because they don't talk together. So you have to really think about, yes, Kubernetes gives you that platform to build from, but what is next?
Yeah, and that's why I love the concept of like some of the platforms or bundles or add-ons on top of Kubernetes. So if you look at something like Knative, if you want like a serverless eventing framework, and you don't want to have a specific vendor's implementation of that, we have an open source standard that runs on top of Kubernetes that allows you to be able to write these types of functions and whatnot. Same thing with Istio. You mentioned Istio, it's just super fun. I love Istio, it's super cool. But building up more and more platforms, I think we're at the beginning of some really exciting stuff that's going to be released from everybody in the open source community, everybody as part of the CNCF, pretty much all over the place, where it's going to be, I'm not going to be writing Kubernetes manifests, I'm going to be writing something else that interprets what I actually want to run, that then generates a bunch of Kubernetes manifests as that open standard on the backplane, so that I can deploy whatever type of application I would like. And it's only a matter of time before that is multi-cloud and hybrid aware, so that it understands all of the different types of placement strategies that you're looking for.
Okay, so before we get too in the weeds, because I just realized we're here in Wall Street. We're not in the Bay Area. We're not in the Valley, which kind of means like we're not in Kansas anymore. And so I want to understand who's in the room. How many of you guys work in financial services? Okay. Definitely that half of the room. What did we have, like a masking tape, a line, say FinServ over there. Okay, how many of you guys are the architects? Okay, and operators, and so you guys are designing your infrastructure and using this stuff, and okay, because I don't want to get too in the weeds, and we don't want to go down like an open source and standards train if you really want us to tell you how to do this, because if that's where you are in your process. So my next question is, so developing applications, are we going to develop them differently from multi-cloud environment?
I'll jump in. I think, Joseph, back to what you said and tying it to what Lisa's asking, I'm surprised that you found the Microsoft part interesting, because I feel like applications and how applications are bundled is something that we need to make easier. And so I think there's two audiences that seem to be forming. One is people who are builders, and I would describe your teams and your level of investment into the backplane as builders. So the idea of how to run an SLI, SLO, SLA, builders know and want to intimately control. But then there's another audience that I see, especially when I come out to here and Europe, is that there's a lot of those who want to operate but not necessarily build the bottom layers of the stack. And so the application parts from Microsoft, I feel like, are speaking more towards those who want to have an app bundle, but not necessarily build the underlying infrastructure. And this is all to say that I think the ecosystem is big enough now that there might be two lanes forming. One is, how do I run an enterprise? How do I think about multi-cloud sourcing? How do I think about governance and compliance? And much more of a traditional enterprise perspective, but using Kubernetes as the control plane, whether they decide to or know to or not. It's just there for them. And the other one is those who want to build and own and have much more of a tradition or SRE background. So I feel like there's two lanes forming, and maybe this is, Lisa, tying it to your question, is from the perspective of, do application standards make a difference in this case, and how do they drive it? I think there's still a lot of room for improvement around ease of use, around how to handle Rob's presentation the hour before, or the half hour before, I really liked, because ideas of bring your own key encryption, data at rest, how to make it vendor neutral or infrastructure neutral. I think those are all areas that are trying to get more sophisticated. And when I talk to banks, their biggest thing is, if I have a piece of data, I delete the data, I need records of that data for many years, right? 7 years, 10 years, depending on the situation. So all these compliance start forming in the other lane. So from the perspective of how does it all come together, I think there's going to be multiple answers. There's going to be those who, application vendors are starting to bundle using Kubernetes. There's call center routing apps where they're all being packaged in containers already. It's a very quick jump to go into a scheduler like OpenShift or go into a scheduler like Kubernetes. And from that perspective, they want to be able to say, how do I have enterprise level guarantees, and how do I use application definitions? I think that's where that will go. And I don't necessarily know, and honestly, you're the one that can speak better, is I don't see that those who build the infrastructure are going to necessarily take the higher level packaging and say that's the definition, but it may all just unify.
Yeah.
So.
No, I mean, and I think, like I said, if I just step back and what I'm really looking at, especially when I hear like there's architects in the room and I think about like, well, how are we going to build? Because it'd be great if I was in these companies, and the last few I've been in have been these companies that have like these 10 to 15-year-old like Java code bases. So I'm bringing in a lot of the past, and we used to just have that hurdle of like getting to the cloud. Now all of a sudden we are thrown into this situation where we're trying to make these things run. And I think we have to start rethinking and redefining like how do we embrace these cloud native patterns. One way that I've been like really looking more towards is just that we have to start thinking more as like just similar like public cloud. You have to kind of take a more of a platform services perspective, And so when I think about these additional little elements up top, mainly because I'm looking at the platform, it's if you look at like, hey, I want to do multi-cloud, there's a significant cost, and you're in the the data space, which is probably the biggest challenge there is, because where your data's at is generally going to dictate where you're at, and how do I move this. And I know there's been some efforts, especially in like the cloud native communities, to try to create some standards around these things, but that's still going to be the limiting factor. So if I had to go in and start like, all right, here's an initiative, and we have a real strategic reason why, whether it's for disaster recovery, or maybe we want to make sure like, hey, we want this preferred vendor because they give us better pricing, but then you have to table that there could be a lot of additional overhead that you may be absorbing of data transfer, of having like even the skills, because a lot of the tools there are still very primitive. If you asked me today, hey, how are you guys doing multi-cloud? I mean, we're just using basically a lot of the primitives that are DevOps tools. We don't have that magical thing that's going to like spin up something over here on AWS, spin something up on GCE. So some of it is really just SRE acumen. So I think there's definitely some challenges there, but I think we have to really address kind of like how we are building and adapt that a little bit more to take that more macro approach to get across clouds.
I think it's, if I may.
Sure.
One other thing I wanted to jump in with was to answer your question and to kind of build on what you were saying, which is awesome, is this concept of how are you going to build something at a high level versus like a low level. And what's really fascinating is prior to Google, I was working at VMware, and it's kind of interesting that you want like a common control plane, but at the same time, you don't want to have like a least common denominator between each platform, which is really challenging. And I think the goal of the future, which is still being worked out, by the way, is going to be trying to figure out how to avoid vendor lock-in while still taking advantage of platform native capabilities. So like obviously Google has some pretty interesting like data crunching capabilities. Other clouds have different strong suits in some areas and in other areas and whatnot. And if you want to be able to use like fully managed services that provide real value back to your business, but then you want that workload to be portable, you're going to run into some other interesting challenges as a result of that. So I think the role of like DevOps-y type people in the future is going to be figuring out what that cost is. Like, yes, we could run it ourselves. Maybe we could leverage an application that's targeted or platformed specifically for Kubernetes if it works, if it scales appropriately, and if the cost is there to take advantage of that type of thing. But at the same time, what's the reliability type thing that we want to look for? If half the room in here works in financial services, like maintaining uptime is an absolute like paramount. That, security, half a dozen other random things, it's probably the most complex systems that you have to work with. But at the same time, you want that trade-off between this just works, but this works no matter where I deploy it. That's going to be a really tough thing to a tough nut to crack in the future, shall we say.
Yes. And I'm smiling because I love a panelist that actually listens to my questions. But I also love the tangents that you guys go on. And so speaking of those tangents, you've made me think of a whole bunch of new questions. But let's get back to the disaster recovery thing for a minute, because I think that's important. The financial services customers that we speak to, this is a hugely important thing, because as you mentioned, it's about that data. And Kubernetes is great for a lot of things, as is OpenShift or Pivotal or whatever version of it that you're using. But it's not going to take you that last mile. And when you're really looking at that super important data, and you need to protect that data, what are some of the options that folks can think about in order to protect that data and recover it in case of a disaster?
You want to go?
I'll jump in. I mean, for us, Portworx is you could think of it as a cloud native data plane, right? So it has a control plane that integrates deeply into Kubernetes and OpenShift. And so from a DR perspective, our patterns are really around how do you do active standby and how do you do multi-site. So customers are, in this region and elsewhere, are saying they have 2 data centers, how do they fail over? How do they fail over to public cloud? So there's always a network component, but there's, from our perspective, the difference between what existed before and what exists now is before you used to restore data. Now we're trying to say because we're so tightly integrated as a data plane into Kubernetes and OpenShift, where we're storing the full stack. So from a platform-centric approach, what we want to say is that all applications can run. They can fail over to another data center, and they can restore not just the volumes of data, but all the way up to the running application. And we get very deeply integrated in terms of how we do that, in terms of scheduling, failover, replication controllers, and all of the stuff that Kubernetes provides. I think that's our perspective, and I think that also can apply to WAN scenarios. But that's a platform-based approach. I don't know if others have a different perspective of how they want to see it or how they do achieve disaster recovery.
Yeah, I think for how we're in the advertising cloud, how we kind of do it is we have definitely things that need to be fully available, or else we're not generating revenue. So we're actually leveraging, shifting traffic, things like that, so that we can immediately all right, this zone is down, make it available over here. And then, as far as like I said, the data stuff, there's certain things we make some trade-offs. We have to kind of just be pragmatic about that. Can we recover this, or what does that mean time to recover so that it's fully available again? Because there is those stateful things that that we know that are not going to just fail over it dynamically like a lot of our more edge type of assets that are out there. So it's still kind of a work in progress for us. We know that we can recover, and we're leveraging clouds to do this. Now, in this magical world of, that I've been chipping away at this for like a decade or so, trying to figure out how to leverage these things. I think we finally have kind of like the primitives to kind of build from. I think it still needs a little bit more work. Definitely looking at companies like in the cloud native storage space that are actually looking beyond that traditional kind of storage as ways to address it, and then architecting towards things like where you see like CockroachDB is like a good example of this conference of those are the things that we're looking towards that will enable a lot of that more highly available, because I'd rather be fully available than having to deal with a disaster, if you had asked me.
So Joseph, are you moving workloads between clouds, or are you just standing up the same workloads, the same clusters in different regions?
I think I think that's a really common starting point, is to just take the things that you can easily run that are very common. So we have like a specific application type that is, we just need a fleet of them, and so we can spin them up in different zones. A couple years ago, what really started for us was we'd have because of a specific customer, they would be, could you spin up in this zone? And we're like, wow, we don't have a data center that's right there, and we're trying to meet quality of service in regards to latency. So it was like that really kind of triggered hey, we can let's build some of that framework to see if we could do it. Once we kind of realized that, and definitely I don't want to be in the business of building up data centers. I like when I could just go to public cloud. It's much more enjoyable experience. But it was one of those other areas where we could actually be like, let's leverage that versus trying to continually expand and have to really scale up in the data center space.
It's interesting you mentioned that, though. Thanks to some of the new advancements that we've got with, say, service meshes and things like that, one of the really interesting patterns that I try to talk about with customers is, you hit the nail right on the head, which is super awesome. I like this guy, he's pretty cool. Which is this concept of moving beyond disaster recovery into highly available systems, and I want to even move beyond that into completely fault-tolerant systems. So one of the architectural patterns that I notice from the field is, a company will say, well, we're going to put everything in this region, and then we'll have another region or another cloud as sort of like a backup. And I'm like, but why? Why not just have a complete unified service mesh that connects everything together? Assuming that you have transit, then you can build things in such a way that even if you lose the entire eastern seaboard, the only thing that suffers is you have a little bit of extra latency if you have customers that are on the eastern seaboard that are going to be connecting to your services. And given the fact that, Google, for example, is heavily investing in this area, especially with the network that we have, storage portability, things like that, but also with a large group of vendors and whatnot for third-party services that are built on top of it, some of these new technologies, I think, are fundamentally changing the way that you think about disaster recovery or just site reliability in general, or what you can expect out of public cloud offerings. Because it really should be, my business always runs under any circumstances, period. I don't have to compartmentalize things and whatnot. It just works, right? So that's what we kind of want to move towards.
So that helps with the east-west traffic, right?
Sure.
But then how about the consistency part? Because what Joseph was also bringing up is CAPM. So how do you deal with the data portions in that?
So that's an interesting one. So you've got the sort of the Google answer, which is you've got a handful of different ways to store either unstructured or structured data. And as of right now, the structured data side to things is, like the default answer is, well, you just use Spanner because it's amazing, which is a really awesome horizontally scalable SQL database that allows you to have a bunch of shards and things like that. And you have multi-masters and atomic clocks to try to keep things in synchronization, and all that other fun stuff, which is super fun. Just like Cockroach, right? So if you wanted like third-party vendor-neutral type things, you could take a look at that. If you wanted to leverage multiple data flowing into and out of other systems, there's that. If you wanted to take advantage of a lot of like cloud-native things, so for example, I want to make sure that anything that I have in, say, Google Cloud Storage is also replicated somewhere else, well, then you need something that's going to copy that between, say, GCS and S3. So there's different strategies depending on how the data is flowing into and out of the system. But theoretically speaking, with some of the new technologies, again, going back to open standards that you mentioned, so things like Apache Beam, for example, being able to write something that says all of the data that's coming in here is now like shunted into two different backends. This one backend could be on a completely different cloud than this other backend, and we're actively like storing things. Or through advanced storage drivers in Kubernetes, we can store a bunch of different data for recovering from persistence or whatever it happens to be. But all of that uses a heck of a lot more application-centric like coding and changes.
Right.
Meaning you don't just get that for free. You don't just turn a key and then magically I have fault tolerance. It's a heck of a lot of interoperability between DevOps people, SRE, and the actual application developers to bring that together in a meaningful way. So it's challenging.
So I want to ask you guys a question because we're all at the multi-cloud conference. So did you come here to learn about multi-cloud, or are you already running multi-cloud? So show of hands, who is already running multi-cloud? Okay, that's Bassam, you don't get to raise your hand. I'm talking about like customers here. Okay, all right. So I asked the same question to the folks in Europe that we presented to during KubeCon, and it was even less hands. So kind of goes back to my hype cycle question, Eric. We love to debate about where we are in hype cycle and where we really are on this journey. And we do talk to a lot of customers, and some of our financial services customers are pretty far ahead, we think, coming to multi-cloud. But Eric, what do you think we are in this hype cycle?
So I think hype cycles there's probably many moments, and so I'm going to give a non-answer answer. I feel like there's two things happening that I noticed. One is there's a sourcing component, so government regulations, the idea that you have to be able to go into another cloud quickly is a regulation that I've seen from especially European customers. So there is a sourcing angle that is very real. The other one is user experience. It's a little bit similar to what Sebastian was saying, but if I want to take advantage of a first-party service, TensorFlow, somewhere, or machine learning, and the idea here is my users are very close to another site, I want to be able to deploy to that region. There seems to be a sourcing answer that is very real. There's a user experience that's really important, and it's happening now. I think from a bulk mainstream, it's still coming to be, but it is a design pattern that everyone is planning for. So I think it's critical, whether it's a platform or re-architecting the application is the one that I think is an active debate. Personally, I see it as a platform approach, but that's my opinion. And I think from the perspective of how teams will run, going forward next year and the year after, it's going to always be the design consideration. So whether people are doing it right now, there are absolutely customers doing it in production right now from those two perspectives of sourcing as well as user experience. But afterwards, I think the bulk will be doing it more from this is just the right way to do it. That's my view.
Yeah, it's kind of tough because even when we met in May and we talked about some of these things, there's some companies out there that are trying to, like, in my opinion, I feel like they are trying to boil the ocean with trying to build this control plane of control planes, to get multi-cloud enabled. And if I had to say like today, like the things that I use that I feel are enabling us to kind of already in a just a simple way use multi-cloud. I mean, it's things like HashiCorp tools. Like, so what I'd like to see is more of those type of tools developed so that it makes us easy to build and deploy from, and it can just augment our existing pipelines. Because the hardest thing I think is that user experience for like the audience that I'm serving in my office. I'm working with developers. I'm trying to help them so that they can kind of go. I don't want them to think about too much about, hey, I got to go to this cloud or that cloud. I mean, that's the contract that Kubernetes kind of gave us, is that ability to just simply write a manifest. It goes and maintains things in the state that you want these things to be in. So now if I start introducing a lot of the challenges, which does happen because I see this constantly with what we've learned, is like how something performs in the data center versus how something performs in AWS or in GCE. And we have to constantly like vet, and the big thing that we really learned was that we had to get better at our performance testing to really know how things are behaving, so that customer experience, we don't want them to know. And I want to make sure the devs don't even have to have that strain as well, to be like, okay, now all of a sudden I have to absorb this, or I have to write additional tests to be able to address how it behaves in this cloud versus that cloud. And so hopefully, like I said, of these tools that we're using enables me to easily build and architect towards these clouds. We still know we got to work towards a lot of this performance stuff to provide that experience that is good for our developers as well as for our users.
Yeah. So one of the cool things about a 2-day conference is we got to meet a lot of you last night, and I got to crowdsource a few questions, and I promised I would ask them. I'll focus on the ones that came before the adult beverages started flowing. We'll go there first. So how do you connect the clouds? This person said our biggest issue is the VPN.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one to try to solve.
That's why you're the experts here to solve it.
Yeah, it gets really challenging. There's essentially two sort of approaches that we start to see, particularly through no fault of my own. I tend to work primarily with financial services institutions. I didn't necessarily choose that. It's just we have quite a few of them in New York, and being that I'm based out of New York, there you go. And that's always a big concern. Luckily, they have cache to be able to actually set up dedicated interconnects or direct connects at peering locations, and then you can have private transit across both of those things, which is great. For a slightly different answer, though, I love the concept of having zero trust networks that are designed to be secure for every single call that you end up having. So we had a paper that we published called Beyond Corp, which is a concept of no VPNs for anybody that works at Google. If you want to access services, you can access good services just fine. You take advantage of higher level protocols, things like that and whatnot. That works pretty well, being able to get things working, but at the same time, there's a paradigm shift that needs to happen to move from public IP addresses to, from private IP addresses to public IP addresses with the appropriate application level security and whatnot. But that would be the super scalable way to be able to introduce things. Or we can do some really interesting cross-connect type things, like in cloud centers and whatnot. Anybody else?
Would that work for you, Joseph, that solution?
It definitely is. I think it's an area that there's an opportunity for that to be solved, because it doesn't. There's no one clear answer, and then what happens is we'll use our legacy approaches of establishing VPNs, and they're not that cloud native. And believe me, we've set up tunnels at times, and then all of a sudden someone makes a commit that blows it up, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, why is this replication stop? And then we realize oh yeah, it's because somebody made this change. And so I think there's definitely an opportunity there. I know we were talking to somebody else who was dealing with it with 2 different cloud providers, and they are offering up an open source project that I think is coming out it's coming KubeCon. So I think it's an area where I'm looking forward to. If it behaves in a cloud native tooling way, I'm all for it. But right now we are, like a lot of us, we're having to use a lot of the enterprising tools that got us here today, and we're just communicating in a more traditional sense, and it comes at a cost. And that's, network transit is not cheap.
So cloud native, there's that word again. So that brings up my next question, which also came up. Should every application be run in a multi-cloud way? I mean, stateful, stateless, everything out there?
I like to think so. If you can run your
containerize
application,
everything.
As many of the 12 factors that you can put inside of your app, the better. I like stateless, large-scale stateless applications because they're super easy to port and whatnot. It's the stateful part that's the really tricky thing, which people are still working on. But as much as is humanly possible, I think will make all of the DevOps and SRE people happy.
That can't possibly be a unanimous answer. Do you guys feel like there's applications that
I'm wincing over here.
I know. I can see people wincing over there through these bright lights.
Yeah, it's tough because there's some of these applications that were not even built with cloud in mind, that a lot of us have to work within those constructs. And I think it comes back to if you step back of when containers really emerged and we're all there and hey, stuff everything into a container. And I'm the first guy that was saying that as well. But then there was some workloads that I'm just hey, that thing is it's rocking on a VM. You got your 349s, whatever you have, and maybe it's coming from a vendor that you don't have control over. Maybe it's not built within house. Well, you're going to have to really make some smart decisions about that application it may not be suited for that. And I think that's a little bit less multi-cloud and more about, is it the right workload type of question that you have to ask yourself. So, if I lived in this great world where we were just like, hey, we built things net new, oh yes, of course, yeah, I'm 100% there.
Right, that's not the
So
world we live in.
I want to jump in here. I feel like just going back to the last question in this one, there's always going to be mainframes. There's always going to be things that run in COBOL or some other system. So should everything go into container, mainframes, et cetera? Probably won't. But there should be the idea that there's a platform, and I don't want to have many approaches of how I maintain the new applications. So should stateful applications go on the platform? We believe absolutely yes. And so from the perspective of why, it becomes that all the experiences, all the apps you want to build, anything about how your users can have real-time stats, how they can have fraud detection, how they can spin up a stack, those all require some answer or some handling, and obviously that's what Portworx is doing. So from the perspective, should I stand up a system, a platform that can run anything? Absolutely yes. And so then going forward, I think, whether the pattern means there's a lot of east-west VPN traffic, I don't know, right? I think the idea of repeatedly standing up a system in a cloud close to my users, that's probably the place I would start. Whether I need to shunt and shard across, there are cases where you will, but I think that that's a choice that not everyone has to take.
Luckily, service meshes make that much easier to do these days. So that's my plug for service.
Hence
I
my
can tell you
favorite
some
side
Google.
hustle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like service.
So can we put the slide back up for 1 second? Because I want you guys to be able to ask questions too. The slide deck. I promise I won't do death by PowerPoint. I promise. I really only have 1 slide. Can you guys go back 1 slide? The one with all the pretty pictures of all the pretty people on stage? There you go.
Too far.
Yeah.
Too far again.
That one. I'm putting this up because here's how to reach us if you want to keep asking us questions. I've also opened my DMs, so I think we have a microphone and we can ask some questions here, but if you're a little bit too shy, see, introverts, I got you. You can tweet at me and we'll make sure we answer the question. But is there any live questions in the audience? Jim is walking around with that microphone. None of this stimulating conversation brought up any thoughts, or you're just going to come up afterwards and ask us all one by one?
Basam's the big multi-cloud guy.
I know. We got a little crossplane shot out here earlier. He's going to pay us for that later.
So how much do you guys are concerned? I guess it's more Adobe more than anything. How much are you concerned about just skills across all these different technologies as you deal with all the multiple different clouds? And how do you manage that process of just, understanding what you have, understanding what's being used?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I think it's I'm very specific to my business unit, so I'm very fortunate. I actually have a few colleagues of mine who are here that are speaking that I think they get the more macro view because they're seeing, more than just what I have. My role is primarily it's AWS assets as well as what we have in the data center. And yeah, I mean, it definitely gets challenging. I think the times that we really know what we have is when we have to bring our bills down, or we start looking at what's really up there. Are we using it? And that's kind of what happens. I think that's where the driver, where you really have to, we inventory. Getting on Kubernetes has allowed us to be able to have a better hold of what we're running at any one time. But then it's not just that world. We also have other elements as well. So it's an ongoing challenge. Fortunately for me, I'm only within one segment, and we have individuals who are looking at the broader, and they kind of have that challenge of it. So I wouldn't say it's not my problem, but mine's a little bit more finite.
Okay, just checking to see if there's any Twitter questions. Any other questions? Okay, Jim? Jim?
We're great.
Work for a living. Over there, question. Oh, you got one. Okay, perfect.
Thank you. So we see multiple flavors of Kubernetes, right? One is obviously the plain vanilla Kubernetes, and there is OpenShift, right? And there is something pivotal version, right? How do they all converge on common API, or do they going in different directions, or how do you see that? And the second question, if I may ask, right, while I have this one, is right. Still, I'm unclear on the stateful workloads, especially take simple relational database, MySQL or Postgres. How can you do it on Kubernetes or any of these things and at the same time provide fully managed capability. That means I don't have to worry about patching, backups, recovery, those kind of stuff. So I feel like still there is a lot of work to be done, especially for stateful workloads on this Kubernetes platform.
Well, from a multiple Kubernetes vendor perspective, one of the things to keep in mind is that Kubernetes is like a registered trademark of the CNCF, which was kind of cool. Google gave it to them so that we can have like an actual standard that not one company can potentially monopolize. And what they're offering now is like a certified Kubernetes platform. So if you have a specific version, then that API that you have across a variety of different Kubernetes distributions will be stable and you'll have guaranteed functionality. The issue with all of that comes into platform-specific things. So for example, load balancers across platforms are going to be slightly different. Storage capabilities between platforms are going to be slightly different and whatnot. But the really cool thing about it, to kind of answer your second question, is what Eric had mentioned earlier in the talk was that we're starting to see a heck of a lot of vendors start converging on Kubernetes as their preferred distribution medium. So for example, for stateful workloads that are either relational or NoSQL or something like that, there are vendors out there that will say, I will manage your database for you and backups and these and so on and so forth, but it deploys into a Kubernetes cluster and it configures everything across the board. Then you just have to double check to make sure that it works in a variety of different IaaS-specific platforms, or it works with other third parties like Portworx, for example, to make sure that you can have all of the plugins work. But it's getting easier, but it's definitely not a solved problem. But I'd love to talk to you more about it afterwards.
I'd like to jump in. I agree with everything Sebastian said. I'll say a couple of things. There is a difference to your first question in terms of the different flavors. And so load balancers is a great example. The other one is what kind of experience you give to your end users. So it starts to become, the APIs are conformant, but the things that get packaged in won't necessarily be portable. So it's a consideration to make. And I think that's an inevitable evolution of adding value. So whether you get a project returned to you or a namespace, it starts to have semantic differences in terms of all the flavors you choose. There are some flavors that are more upstream consistent, and so we can go through the details at any point. So that's the point about different flavors of Kubernetes. There is differences, and some are more strongly flavored differently than others. The second part is, from a stateful workload, I think from our perspective, it's really that there is a standard interface of how you consume storage, but the whole upgrade and all the experiences have been you're taking advantage of the control plane of Kubernetes, but then the data plane is something like Portworx will solve, right? The replication, the snapshots. So those are all things where we think that's what customers are adopting, have been adopting for quite some time now, and so happy to talk more as well.
Different flavors of Kubernetes. I love it when he says that. It sounds so delicious, as opposed to vanilla Kubernetes, which this actually becomes a very East Coast versus West Coast thing. We find that back in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's a lot of roll your own, whereas in other areas we see a lot more of the distros. So I'm just out of curiosity, who here has rolled their own Kubernetes? All right, and who's running from a distro? Okay, Joseph, are you?
We roll our own.
That now means something else in California too, but I just thought of it as I said it. Recently legalized. So and New York is probably way ahead of us on that. I don't even know. But okay, that's interesting. So yeah, there is difference between the different distros, and you should look at them. And there's a lot of experts here who can talk to you about them as well. But what it usually comes down to, we just went through Europe, and almost everybody is on OpenShift or Pivotal or something, mostly because of the support. Really, it comes down to that. So or a throat to choke. So last words, or how are we for time? Okay, so they're all somewhere on this journey, but I'm guessing more on the beginning of the journey if they're at this conference. Next year we'll get into kind of more day 2 and more like really roll up your sleeves and do the hard problems. But getting started, what is your advice?
Keep it open and you will go far.
Yeah, I would just say, just just like anything with that, if we've gone through this cloud journey, just take the least risky, simplest workloads. I think those are always the way to start. Like for us, like finding a zone that for proximity for our customers with something that is stateless, it's an easy win, and then you can kind of like tease out some of the challenges that come out of that.
I think for me, change always takes a while to get there, but then it happens very quickly. So there's real benefits to get out of this. And so I think, leaning in and knowing what you're pushing for, I think there's a lot of things that our users find. It increases uptime. It makes automation much better in terms of their life. And so expect a lot and push into it. So.
And I would say, I get to say things too. Yeah, I would say that find trusted partners to work with, absolutely. And don't forget about that data. Automate everything you can, but don't forget about that data. Super important part. So your data management strategy is going to be huge. So that's us. This is how you can continue to talk to us. All day we'll be around for a little while if you want to come talk to us one-on-one. Otherwise, tweet at us, and we promise we will answer you. So nice to meet all of you. Had some great conversations last night, and thank you again, Jim, for this amazing conference. Conference number 1 is hard to do, so we hope you all come back next year and see us again. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, guys.